when I started working, very interested in the history, the embodiment of ideas of evil. And one of the things his work did for me was to help me clarify the distinction between two terrible things, a distinction that has to be made, and that's the distinction between tragedy and evil. And I don't think you can talk about it evil at all until you distinguish it from tragedy. And so I'm going to try to distinguish evil from tragedy by making some reference to the essential existential condition of human beings. I would say that the nature of human being is such that it consists of a confrontation with the bounded finite with the unbounded infinite. And that those are the bare facts of the matter. And the facts are that the world of experience as it presents itself to us is literally and not metaphorically complex beyond our capacity to understand. And that means that people deal in a real sense on an ongoing basis with the infinite. And I believe that that fact is the reason why religious experience is essentially, and belief is essentially endemic to mankind. It's a human universal, and it's not because people believe. It's because human existence as such consists of a confrontation between the finite and the infinite. And religious systems merely take that into account. Now, our finitude in the face of the infinite has some inevitable consequences, and I would say those consequences are essentially the existential conditions of life. And the first of those consequences is that the finite is always overwhelmed by the infinite. It has to be, because it can't encapsulate it. And so what that means is that that suffering is central to the nature of human existence. And suffering exists as a consequence of the consequences of our limitations. I mean, every single person who's alive is going to die. And every single person who's alive is going to deal with serious physical illness and mental distress. If they don't suffer, if they aren't suffering it directly, immediately, right now, on their own, it's almost inevitably the case that every single person who walks the earth is confronting the bare bones of reality at that level in the guise of an afflicted family member. And so the fact of our finitude is again, no academic issue. It's central to the nature of our being, and we're forced to deal with it on an ongoing basis. So I would say insufficiency is built into human experience, and there are existential consequences to that. Now, I read something a long time ago, and I don't remember who wrote it, but it was written about Jewish commentary on the Torah. God is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent. What does he lack? And the answer is limitation. And that's a riddle and an answer of unparalleled brilliance as far as I'm concerned, because I think it speaks deeply to something about the central nature of existence itself. And that is that, and one of the things I realized right away was that as you remove the vulnerabilities, you remove the thing you love. And then I started to understand more deeply that vulnerability was a precondition for human being, and that was a desirable precondition, because the things about human existence that are wonderful and remarkable are so integrally tied up with vulnerability that they're actually inextricable. The Jewish commentary, what the infinite lacks is the finite, is a more abstract way of getting at the same thing. If you could do absolutely anything you wanted at any point and be anywhere you wanted and be anything you wanted, and if there was nothing that was out of your reach, there would be nothing to do, because you'd be everything at once. And when you're everything at once, which is at least in principle the position of God, there's no story and there's no being, and there's something about being that is a story, and without limitation there's no story. So then the question starts to become, with regards to consideration of human vulnerability, is there a way to conduct your life in such a manner that the intrinsic vulnerability that characterizes your life is rendered not only acceptable but desirable? And to me, that's the central question of existence. And I tell you, get that wrong, you're on the wrong track. And if you're on the wrong track, man, you are in one terrible place. I would say, with regards to tragedy, humans are vulnerable, and that's tragic. But if tragedy is the price that we pay for existence, then so be it, if existence is justifiable. And so tragedy itself, which is merely a revelation of our vulnerability, can't be regarded as evil. It's a condition of existence. And so it's necessary to distinguish the tragic conditions of existence from evil before you can even address the problem. And I think what that means to some degree is you should not blame on the relationship between the finite and the infinite the terrible failings of humanity that can be laid directly at the feet of human beings. So earthquakes aren't evil, and cancer isn't evil, and mental illness isn't evil, and predators aren't evil. They just are part of the way things are. But there are certain categories of human action that are definitely outside the parameters of mere tragedy, and those are the things we really have to get a handle on. Evil for me is differentiated from tragedy by its lack of necessity and its voluntarism. And it's a tenet, I think, of modern materialistic thought that there are social or material causes for actions, and it's an extraordinarily useful theory. And I think one of the unfortunate consequences of that is that we've tended to write off much of human misbehavior and attribute it to, say, insufficiencies in material conditions, which is not an acceptable theory. There are all sorts of human cultures that were characterized by virtually complete absence of material luxury, well-being, whose cultures were highly functional and highly moral. And to describe the propensity towards misbehavior as a consequence of economic inequality is entirely beside the point as far as I'm concerned. Evil is more pernicious than that which is generated, for example, by social inequality. I think it's actually, although this is a terrifying thought in some ways, it's more appropriate to consider it a form of demonically warped aesthetic. My academic research, as well as my clinical experience, has revealed to me that what appears to lie at the bottom of motivation for the excesses of behavior that characterize evil are two tightly causally related factors. One, arrogance, another, resentment. And both of those are tied up with vulnerability of human beings in the face of the infinite, but tied up with something more profound as well. And so what does Cain do? Well, the logical thing would be listen, because if the structure of reality itself tells you something, it's best to listen since there's no way out of it, but that's not what Cain does. He's so incensed by his sensual vulnerability, compromised and exacerbated by his failure to make the appropriate sacrifices and to conduct himself appropriately, that he decides then and there, number one, to destroy his ideal, to reduce the tension that he feels when that ideal exists as a contrast point, and number two, to destroy the favored son of God. And so he goes out into the field and kills Abel. And God comes along and says, "Where's my favorite son?" And Cain says, "I killed him." And it's so interesting to me that that story is placed, really, it's the third story in the Old Testament. It's with the archaic stories. And it's a story that reveals, as far as I can tell, that there are two essential patterns of reaction to the self-conscious, vulnerable conditions of existence. And one is humble approach to infinity with determined attempts to make the appropriate sacrifices. The other is arrogance, resentment, the keeping of everything good for oneself, and the degeneration of the soul into something that's homicidally murderous. I said that tragedy is a precondition for being. Being is the interplay between the finite and the infinite, and in that interplay there's tragedy, and there's no way out of that. Evil's something different. Evil's the conscious attempt to make the conditions of existence more pathological than they have to be. And it's motivated by conscious intent. The motivations arise because people pay a terrible price for their self-conscious awareness, and that awareness is their awareness of their vulnerability. And that is a terrible thing to be aware of. That vulnerability can be confronted forthrightly, accepted, and the appropriate decisions made. Alternatively, people can retreat into their own rationalistic arrogance and attempt to deceive themselves and everyone else about the nature of their own existence and about the nature of reality. That pathway leads to nothing but destruction. I think that there's good reason to assume that it's too late in our developmental course as a species for that path to be acceptable anymore, because we're too powerful. And if too many people stay on that path, we're going to do ourselves in. And so I would say, as we've become more technologically powerful, an increasing moral burden is being placed on each of us. It matters to the destiny of the cosmos whether or not you get your moral act straight. And I don't mean that in a trivial way. I believe that that's as close to an empirical fact as anything that can be demonstrated. And I also believe that's as terrifying a thing to consider as anything you could possibly imagine. And maybe it's too much to ask of people. But you know, our great religious traditions do continually remind us that inside every human being there's a spark of divinity. And that idea is a precondition for our entire system of law. There's always the possibility that it's true. And if it's true, it means that there's an infinite avenue of potential that lays open to every single person, and that the ability to transform the terrible conditions of reality into something not only acceptable but worthy of celebration actually lies within our grasp. And the alternative to that is the continual generation of a kind of hell that's so incomprehensibly awful that by any reasonable person's standards, it has to be regarded as something to avoid.